Hello, good morning, and welcome back to Jack's Coffee Break. My name is Jack, and today I thought I would tell you how I start a franchise zoo. So this method has been fairly fail-safe for me. I've never had it go wrong, and it is designed with the intention that you will never take out a loan, and that your zoo will begin producing a profit rapidly. So I know that those are kind of the two things that we tend to want to avoid when we start up a new zoo. So I have here a mock-up in sandbox mode of what my franchise zoo initially starts to look like before I start to think about remodeling. So I have tried to record this in actual franchise mode and show you how I do it. It takes at the bare minimum an hour and a half, and the vast majority of that is showing, not telling, and I find that it ends up being too confusing and it doesn't explain my thoughts very well. So we're doing this in sandbox mode, and I'm going to reveal sections in stages when we get there. So right now, with the path and the barrier, this is basically what my franchise mode starts off looking like. So I start off with, we're all going to have some kind of default entrance. And I do want to mention, because usually the entrance starts like across the buildable space line, you can actually pick up and move your entrances. You don't have to stick with this. So you can pick up an entrance or a spawn point, you can pick up the little ticket booth, and you can move them farther inward to your zoo. So this is really handy if you don't want to be crammed up against an edge, but it's also really important for your power sources. So your ticket booth right here is a power source, and it's going to generate a fairly wide area. If you have this, smashed up against an edge, you're missing out on like 50% of the power. So it is worth it to move it inside the map. And again, you can do that from the start for free. It's not going to cost you anything. The main reason why we want to stick to this power area is because we want to limit the number of staff that we're having to hire. So right now, again, we're only in mock-up, so my finances are going to be buggy. But my ongoing expenses, if we look down this list, I have a little bit of facility running cost, I've got a little bit of power cost, and that has to do with that section of the zoo over there where we built our African wild dog enclosure to show off how to build habitats. But the largest expense by far is my staff. Like, without a doubt, that is the most expensive thing. So the more that we can limit the number of staff that we hire initially, the better. So to that end, I recommend that you only hire a veterinarian and a keeper. That's it. Don't hire anybody else. You don't need a caretaker, you don't need a mechanic, you don't need a security guard, you don't need an educator, you don't need any of those. You also do not need to hire your own vendors. When you place down some kind of food kiosk or drink kiosk or whatever, it's going to come pre-stocked with a vendor. You don't need to hire more yet. So that's all I recommend. Get your keeper, get your caretaker, and for the most part, you can actually leave this off for a little bit until your guest needs start to say, hey, I want stuff. So you can actually leave these off. I sometimes do, sometimes don't. It doesn't break the formula to add them early or anything. So because we're only adding in a veterinarian and a keeper, only things that we need are our trade center, our keeper hut, our veterinary clinic, and our staff room. That's it. You do not need a quarantine, you do not need research, you do not need a workshop. So the main reason why is cost. If you buy just these 4 buildings, it's going to cost you $8,000. If you buy the entire kit, it's going to cost you $14,000. So you might as well just save your $6,000 and spend it somewhere else. So only stick with these. That's going to keep your veterinarian busy, and it's going to keep your keeper busy, which is what you want. The other reason why we're trying to leave off as many buildings as we can, especially the quarantine, is because right now we just don't need it. So I'm doing this in post. Don't worry about it. Don't think about it. Time doesn't exist here. Anyway, so I will get a veterinarian, and then I will not get a quarantine. Partially because of the cost. If we just look at our staff facilities, our quarantine small is going to cost us $4,000, as is our veterinary surgery. So again, we're looking at this set, which is going to cost us $8,000. Just by adding on a quarantine, we're bumping that up to $12,000. $4,000 is a hefty chunk of cash when you're first starting off. So That's number one. Number two is because you don't actually have enough animals to warrant a quarantine. And especially not if you're playing in actually franchise mode. So if you're playing on challenge mode or any of the offline modes, career mode, whatever, the main reason why you want to quarantine is because when you bring in new animals, the ones that the game automatically generates have like a 1 in 4 chance, sometimes higher, of having some kind of injury or illness. So you want that quarantine to be able to catch it and to not introduce it into your zoo when you first bring in those animals. However, when you're first starting out, when you have your first 2, 3, 4 habitats going up, the more time that you wait between putting down another animal and putting down your first animal and putting down your next animal is costing you money at that point. So you really do not have time to wait the 6 months or whatever that a quarantine is going to expect of you to check those animals out and then rush them over to the veterinary clinic and then get them into the zoo. You don't have that time. You don't really have the money either. And of course your veterinarian, it doesn't really need, they don't need wiggle room. So the nice thing about having a quarantine is that if your veterinarians are really busy, the animals can sit in there for a little bit while a veterinarian deals with their task and then comes over to heal that sick animal. Because the zoo is so small, if I were to just put an animal directly into the pen without quarantining it, I will almost immediately get an alert that says, hey, this animal has campy, or hey, this animal has an injury, or something like that. My vet will be notified, and they can rush over immediately to deal with it and then bring it back to its habitat. It just reduces the amount of time that the animal's out of its enclosure, and it reduces the amount of time that you're waiting for a vet to detect it. You just don't need to wait that time. The veterinarian's going to pick up on it almost immediately. And because they're not researching anything, they're going to have time to heal that animal almost immediately. So you don't want to get them researching, because if you do that, then you have to spend money on a quarantine. And if you have to spend money on a quarantine, you're losing money. You could be getting through donations already because you have that animal in your zoo. So it creates this kind of feedback loop. So I break it by just not having a quarantine until I get to the point where I have about 5 animals. And at that point, it is now worth it because I'm probably hiring a second vet. I'm probably thinking about adding in my research buildings. At that point, a quarantine is worth it, and I have the money to be able to do it. Lastly, you're going to need a first animal of some kind. So I have a wide selection of first animals, and we'll go over them, but the main one that I'm going to recommend is you get the collared peccary. So this was the 2023 anniversary animal. It's available with the base game, which is why I'm recommending it so highly. Everybody has access to this animal. They are fantastic, and the main reasons why is because of their requiremements. Here we go. So they need a fairly limited amount of space. It is 300 meters per animal. And then it goes up 7 meters per each extra animal. It's really not a big deal. You can contain them in a 1.25 meter barrier. This is actually too tall. You would only need to add just a little bit more to any kind of construction piece barrier. We will talk about that in a little bit. Next, while they do have a fairly large group size, this also means that you're going to get a lot of babies because they reproduce very easily and they mature in 1 year. So you're going to start earning conservation credits and money very quickly. They are least concerned, so you're not going to get a whole lot, but you're going to get a lot through quantity mostly. So this is an animal that I strongly recommend, but we will go through others. So normally I will build this very close to my entrance, and I'm not thinking about the future right now. The only thing that I'm thinking about for the future is that I have these 8-meter wide paths. That's it. The reason why I'm doing this is partially for congestion and partially because when I go to remodel, it just makes my life a lot easier. So these are the only staff that I start with, and then I get some kind of animal that doesn't have any kind of special requirements and is a herbivore. Those are the main 2 things that you're looking for. You don't want it to have any kind of water requirement because then you have to get some kind of water filtration or you have to manually clean out the water yourself. And that's fine. You can do that, if you want to, but it is a little bit more management. You definitely do not want to build a power source or a water cleaner or anything like that because then you'd have to hire a mechanic and that's an extra person on your payroll. Climbing requirement is not such a big deal, but most of the animals that fit the bill for everything else that have a climbing requirement are going to be things like lemurs. They're mostly shy animals, and you want to try and avoid shy animals because these are going to be your only stars for a while. And while there is one-way glass in the game, it's pretty expensive. So this is the basic setup. This is all I do. And of course I've got my bins, benches, and donation boxes. All that kind of stuff. Okay, so once I have my first animal down, usually guests are going to start trickling into the zoo. I do have the spawn point off for right now just because it's easier to show things when, you know, you don't have a bunch of guests running around. Once I get my first animal down, my next priority is to get my second and third animal as quickly as possible. So normally I try and stick with the same parameters that I mentioned before. You know, we want herbivores who don't have special requirements and don't take up a lot of space. That's the core of what I'm looking for. So to that end, a couple of the other ones that I recommend are going to be like the red-necked wallaby and the red kangaroo. So these guys are both fantastic. This animal right here, the red kangaroo, just for starting up franchise mode, made the Australia pack worth it for me. I don't really build with that pack at all, but the animals in it are really good, especially when you need to start up a franchise very quickly and you need something reliable. These guys are great for that. And I will show real quick, since we're on the subject, if you're looking for another base game animal, Bactrian camel, surprisingly good. They can be a little bit pricey, and you know, you will need two, and depending on which market you're looking at, they can be a little bit rare. But if you can get Bactrian camels, I do recommend them. And there's a few others, like you could probably do ostriches, you can probably do aardvarks, you know, things like that. So there's a number of animals, but these are the main ones that I recommend. You know, camel, peccary, wallaby, kangaroo. Those are fantastic. So normally at this point, I am getting in my second and third animals. And right around now, I have enough guests making a mess of my zoo that I will hire a caretaker. At this point, I'm also starting to make a profit. Up until that point, no. At this point, yes. So normally I'll get a initial trickle of about 200 to 300 guests. You know, they'll walk in, they will observe that a peccary exists, and then they'll leave. And if you don't expand quickly, that'll be it, and your zoo will die. So you need to hurry up and get your second and third animal in. Once you have these guys in, you start to have a fairly consistent and steady flow. Your profits are going to start to go up, and you're going to start to see that doubling between your profit margin. So your expenses are going to be approximately half of what you're making, and that's really where you want to sit, and you want to keep that ratio for as much a franchise as you possibly can. Once you have your 3 animals in, right around now is when I recommend getting your exhibits. So it is very popular right now in the community. It's kind of like one of those niche metas. So it is a fairly popular meta right now for people to just get a few exhibits, get a few exhibit animals, not bats. But something like American bullfrog, centipede, maybe a snake, definitely spiders. Insects and frogs are usually like your best ones. And to get a whole bunch of these exhibits, and then to use and then to use population management to increase your cash, and depending on the mode that you're in, your conservation credits. So in franchise mode specifically, you can't earn conservation credits through this population management. You have to send them to the trade center, and then you have to manually release them. I think that's how that basically works. But if you're in challenge mode, or career mode, or sandbox-like, where you've got all your stuff turned on, or whatever, you know, any mode that is not online, essentially, you can also have these guys sold for conservation credits directly, which is really nice. So this is a great way to start farming. And there's a lot of people who will just set down like 4 or 5 exhibits and buy a few animals that go in them, and then just wait for the numbers to go up. And that's fine. You can absolutely do that. That's not how I do things. I normally wait until I've got about 3 animals in, at which point then I have enough cash. I wait for my finances to build back up, you know, back into the 15 to 20k mark. And at that point, I will get exhibit animals and start trying to profit off of them. So once I start to feel comfortable, you know, I've got my exhibit animals in, I've got my first 3 drawing in crowds and making money, I will then go ahead and get a 4th animal, which usually resembles the same kind of requirements that we've had for the other 3. And then by the time that we finally get to the 5th animal, this is when I start to open up to other opportunities, you know. This is about the time when I want to bring in a carnivore. So there are some really good specific carnivores for like your first carnivore that you add to your zoo. I have here the fossa. I found that they're really good. They're a lot of fun. They will give you a little bit of trouble in containing them just because they're really good climbers, but they're pretty cool. They are not very big, and so they don't eat so much. But some of the other ones that I recommend are going to be any of your foxes. So if you have access to like the Arctic fox, these guys are fantastic. One of the other ones that I'm going to recommend as well is if you have it, the Eurasian lynx. These are also very good. Again, the main thing that you're really looking for here is that it's a small carnivore, because yeah, you're bringing in something that's going to eat meat and your expenses are going to bump up quite a bit. At a certain point, your food costs are going to start to meet your staff wages, and that's when things start to get a little bit hairy. And it's also why I recommend that you don't start off with, something like a carnivore right off the bat. So these guys, I really recommend. If you only have the base game, cheetahs are pretty good. Cheetahs are solid. But you could consider some other things. The main thing that you're looking for is that you can actually afford it. So don't get lions, tigers, and bears. Bears are actually okay. You can handle a bear, probably. Not a polar bear, but like a Formosan or, something like that. That's okay. So that's usually what I recommend for my fifth animal, is then I start to get carnivores. At this point, I've usually got another set of food kiosks as well. And so even though these already come with vendors, right about now, I will go in and I will hire an extra vendor, just the one extra. And the reason why I do this is because eventually these guys got to take breaks. So this fifth or sixth or whatever extra one goes in to cover their shifts while they're away. And this is something that I tend to scale up with. So I usually have if I've got 20 vendors, I'll probably have 5 extra people to go and fill those stalls. So that's normally what I like to do. And then at that point I consider, expanding out. Or usually what I end up doing is I will remodel this entire area. I don't actually stick with this format once I get past a certain point. There's just no reason for me to do so. So I will completely send all my animals to the trade center, scrap everything, and rebuild it to become the zoo that I actually want to play in, and not the roadside zoo that I did in order to just get the numbers going. There is usually a financial dip at that point, but when you have 5 animals and then you've got your 2 exhibits, normally you're making a tidy profit. You're making about 10 to 15k. 15k is really high end, 8 to 10k. And your expenses are like 4 to 5k. It's reasonable. And if you let it keep going, this will eventually start to just generate customers and let them come in for themselves. And you don't really have to play the speed game that for the most part you do have to do for this initial set of 3 or 4 or whatever. At this point, I will also start to consider expanding my staff facilities. At this point, I'll get a quarantine, and I'll start doing research for the veterinarian and the mechanic and things like that. And the reason why I feel comfortable now is not only do we have enough of a profit coming in, but if we look at our power, we are now breaching the area that we can actually have power for. So regardless, we're going to have to hire a mechanic. We might as well give him something to do. So at this point I will have keeper, caretaker, veterinarian, mechanic. And your game is also going to start notifying you fairly quickly on that you don't have a security guard. And the reason why I've said don't get I've not mentioned a security guard up to this point is because you don't actually need it until you're into year 2. You need to be fairly into the game. You need to have 3 or 4 habitats. And at that point you're drawing in enough crowds that you might have your first pickpocketing victim. At that point, not when the game notifies you, but when a crime actually happens, then I get a security guard. And the other thing that I do is I use the security cameras, especially this wall-mounted one, and I will go through and I will line all of my paths with security cameras right around this point. Once I get everything refurbished and where I want it, then I will add my security. I do want to mention that you probably want to stick with these wall-mounted because, the pole is 150 and the wall-mounted camera is 10. So, like, why would you ever use the security post? I don't know. Looks, I suppose. But more importantly, this is an area of effect item. So I've had a security camera buried in the ground this entire time. And you haven't seen it, but it works. If we were to actually have guests come in here, the security camera would actually observe them, and this would function just fine. So you can hide your security cameras under the ground, you can put them up on buildings, it really doesn't matter. And the main reason why you want those is because your security guard is a useless lump until you get him trained up to 5 stars. The security cameras actually notify the guard whenever a crime's actually occurred, and then they will go chase down the criminal. But for the most part, they don't actually know anything happened, right? So use security cameras and start training up your security guard as quickly as possible. They're only going to be efficient at their job when they're at 5 stars, so it needs to happen quickly. So from this point forward, I'm basically free to do whatever I want, you know. Usually I will have enough of a profit coming in that, like, again, if I do decide to tear down the entire zoo and remodel it, it's not going to harm me, you know. So that is how I do things. The last thing that I want to mention is that I have been using these corrugated barriers. And I've been using them for illustrative purposes only. I don't actually recommend that you use anything in the barrier habitat except for the null barrier and glass when you have water. And I recommend that for the rest of the game. Just never touch the barriers tab if you can help it. So you will have an ongoing expense for barrier maintenance. And yes, it is an expense that you need to consider, especially since those costs can build up very quickly. That's not actually why. The reason why is because I want my mechanic focusing on making sure that my power source and my water sources don't fail, and on doing research. So what I will do is I will build all of these out of null barriers, and I will actually build structures that look closer to this. So this one I made just purely out of a box. I don't normally build boxes. I'll build those kinds of shapes, but I'll use these parts. I will use the plaster parts, and then I will use the one-way glass. And even though the one-way glass is more expensive, it just works a little bit better, especially, you know, if you do end up finding yourself buying shy animals for whatever reason. It just prevents a whole lot of stress. And on top of that, you know, you can always rip it out and repurpose it for your next build. So normally I build something like this, and if I don't have glass here, it remains the exact same. It's this exact same format. So I'll use a 1 meter wall, and then I'll stack a 1 meter wall 2 meters above it. So it'll be a 1, a 3, and then I'll have actual proper walls. Or whatever is appropriate for the animal. You know, this might be a little bit excessive depending on the critter that you've got. The only thing that really matters is that the guests have this space between the 1 meter and 2 meter line that they can actually see through. This is where their line of sight is at. So as long as you have that unblocked, you're fine. So I will use something like this to fill out all of my different pieces, and then of course, you know, I can repurpose this material, or I can gain the cost back or whatever. The less that I have my mechanics working on these barriers, the better. It saves me money over time, and saves me a lot of time in researching. So that is the core of what I do for franchise mode. The only other thing that I have to add is that once I get the zoo to a certain size, because of the fact that I have so much research I have to do, I will build myself a research center. So again, I normally don't do this until I've got a few animals in. I can justify the cost of hiring a whole bunch of staff that I don't actually need. So this is sort of the format of one of my research centers. You don't have to have this particular, like, you don't have to have an exhibit. You can have this next to a habitat. But I do recommend that you have either an exhibit or a habitat, something that attaches to this building. And the main reason why is because this building is designed for veterinarians and for mechanics. So I will hire 3 veterinarians or however many, and 3 mechanics or however many. And then I will go into their names and I will tag them VR and MR, something like that. And that means vet research and mechanic research. So that way when I'm going through my research tab, I can look right here at my veterinarians and I see their little tag, and I know that I can just put them directly on the research. I don't have to go fishing around for who's associated with what group or whatever. So that is the next thing I do is I build this little research center, and it pumps through research like crazy. Like it starts to get annoying. It goes so fast. Normally I'll attach a power source to it. Just for pure convenience. All of these buildings need to be powered, and if it's not already within that group, it's just handy. But B, it gives my mechanics something to do. So I will set all of this into a work zone, and then my mechanics, if they get fussy or whatever, they can go check on this power source and they can repair it. For my vets, however, I need to have either an enclosure or habitat or something, because your mechanics freak out if they don't have an animal to go check up on. So I will include this next to either my worst habitat that I have, you know, like if I've got a hoofstock enclosure or flamingos or something like that, I'll put this next to them. And then that way they have something to check up on, but then they can go back to doing their vet research, and it's the most well cared for habitat in the entire zoo. Like, it's fantastic. I do want to touch on another thing real quick, because I specified all of the parameters for what I really do want in starting animals, but there are some things that I don't want. So we already covered that we do not want animals that have special requirements. So for example, giant river otters, they require water. I don't want to have an animal that requires any amount of water until I'm to a point where I have to hire a mechanic anyway. At that point, I can start to bring in water animals. For climbing animals, I don't mind them so much. They can come in fairly early, and that's fine. Usually you will need to spend a little bit extra to build climbing sets. I used to be able to use just trees, and the trees would provide more than enough climbing space. They nerfed them at some point, and it's been disappointing. So climbing's not so bad. You can add those in if you want to, or if you have to, or whatever, just depending on your situation. What I don't recommend is getting hoofstock, under any circumstances. For your first handful of animals, don't get hoofstock, and specifically do not get wildebeest. Especially the black wildebeest, don't get them. Do not get them. They are filthy, and they are so prone to disease. If their habitat dips into 50% cleanliness for even a minute, you're probably going to get a disease on anything more than easy, and sometimes on easy mode as well. It just is, it's terrible. So don't get hoofstock. Yeah, I don't care how cheap they are. Save yourself the vet bills. Don't do it. Next thing, same reason, don't get any birds. You know, ostriches are okay. But for example, flamingos, do not get flamingos. Yes, they're cheap. Yes, they're readily available. But they've got a water requirement. You don't want to mess with that. And they are just chock full of diseases, you know. Unfortunately, this also extends to the peafowl. You know, they're also very cheap. They don't take up a lot of room. You know, they don't have any climbing requirements, no water requirements. Easy to keep. Good temperature ranges. You can have, you know, up to 4 to 20, you know, pretty good. But they will bring so much disease into your zoo, and they reproduce so quickly. And they take a while to mature, so you're going to have tons and tons and tons of babies, and you're not going to be able to get rid of them fast enough. I don't recommend peafowls under any circumstances. So those are some of the animals that I do and don't recommend. So yeah, that is how I start franchise mode. Again, I'm trying to be as quick about this as I possibly can, and to a certain extent I am assuming that you know something about the game, you know, that you have played the tutorials and that you do know what you're looking at. So hopefully this has been useful to you, and that it works as well for you as it's worked for me. A lot of it is sitting and waiting for numbers to go up. I'm not gonna lie, there's a lot of waiting at the beginning. That's just how it is. But at the very least, doing this method, you always have something to do. You know, it's not like sitting and waiting for your money to take up with these guys. It's constant. And you can get a franchise mode zoo started and stable within an hour. You know, maybe 2 hours if you go fast. Within 2 hours. Maybe an hour if you go fast. You know, so not too bad. Anyway, I hope that this has been helpful to you guys. Maybe you learned something new. Maybe not. I don't know. Either way, good luck and happy building.